The morning air in Tokyo carried a sharp bite of winter steel. Inside the grand offices of the Imperial Naval General Staff, a line of admirals in white stood before a wall of maps stretching from the Kuriles to Hawaii. It was the first week of January in 1942. Cigarette smoke curled under the high ceiling, blurring the neat red pins that marked the Empire's new frontiers. One of the younger officers stepped forward and read the latest intelligence report captured from intercepted American radio traffic. The Americans, he said carefully, were launching new cargo ships at a pace that defied sense one nearly every few days from yards that had barely existed a year before. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the room. Admiral Osami Nagano, the Chief of Naval General Staff, removed his spectacles and polished them against his sleeve. "Impossible," he muttered. "A ship in weeks? These Americans think steel is paper." Another admiral, remembering his years supervising ship construction at Kure, added dryly that even a small coastal vessel required almost a year of precise riveting and plating. They had built their own destroyers plank by plank, bolt by bolt, with master fitters whose fathers had done the same. The idea that a crowd of untrained factory workers could weld together a seaworthy cargo ship in a month was not only absurd, it was offensive to the very idea of craftsmanship. Their confidence had reason behind it. The Imperial Japanese Navy, in 1941, was the culmination of generations of discipline and obsession with quality. Every major warship built at Kure, Yokosuka, or Sasebo was the product of meticulous human hands. The battleship Yamato, whose construction had begun in 1937, consumed more than 4 years, 75,000 tons of steel, and the lives of countless artisans whose skill bordered on ritual. Rivets were driven by hand, each one inspected under lamplight. The curved armor plates along her flanks were measured to the fraction of a millimeter. She was, to Japanese eyes, not a weapon but a national shrine afloat. In that same winter, across the Pacific, the world's most chaotic and improvised shipbuilding program was taking shape under floodlights and freezing rain. In the marshes along the Willamette River in Oregon, on empty lots in Richmond, California, and in the mudflats of the Delaware, cranes and scaffolds were rising faster than any dry dock ever had. Henry Kaiser, a man with no naval background, had promised Washington that he could build cargo ships the way Detroit built automobiles on an assembly line. Most of the engineers in the Navy's Bureau of Ships thought he was mad. Welding, they said, was too brittle for ocean service. Rivets, though slower, allowed the hull to flex. Welds cracked. Welds failed. Ships lived or died on their rivets. Still, the Americans were desperate for hulls. Submarines were sinking merchant ships faster than shipyards could replace them. So Washington said yes to Kaiser, and the gamble began. Back in Tokyo, none of that mattered yet. The admirals saw the Pacific as a chessboard they already controlled. Their carriers had burned Pearl Harbor to cinders barely a month earlier. The British fleet in the Far East had been annihilated. Their submarines prowled unopposed through the Indian Ocean. They believed time was their ally. Every week of dominance gave their engineers another chance to perfect torpedoes, refine gunnery, and improve ship design. For them, war was an extension of craftsmanship, the same patient pursuit of perfection. The Americans, they assumed, would drown in their own clumsy abundance. Reports trickled in through early spring. Japanese submarine captains near Hawaii claimed to see convoys of identical grey cargo ships, all newly painted, all built to the same lines. One captain counted a dozen in a single afternoon and thought his periscope lenses were playing tricks on him. By April, similar reports arrived from the South Pacific, the Aleutians, and the Indian Ocean. They all described the same improbable thing, identical American freighters appearing faster than Japan could sink them. To the staff officers in Tokyo, these sounded like exaggerations from overtired submarine crews. Even America cannot conjure ships from thin air, scoffed Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome. Their factories make cars and radios, not oceans. But deep inside Japan's own shipyards, engineers were beginning to see cracks not in their welds, but in their assumptions. Since the outbreak of war in China, Japan's industrial base had already been strained. The empire could produce barely 7 million tons of steel a year, a fraction of America's output even in peacetime. Shipbuilding consumed half of that. Every hull demanded not only metal but human skill, tens of thousands of hours of work from craftsmen who had no replacements. Apprentices took years to train. Riveters lost to conscription were impossible to replace. The process that produced a single masterpiece like the Yamato could not be scaled. It was artistry, but artistry did not win industrial wars. The Americans were discovering the opposite truth. At the Kaiser yards, teams of women and men who had never seen the ocean were welding together prefabricated sections like puzzle pieces. Each hull consisted of nearly 200 pre-assembled units, trucked or craned into place, and fused by welders working around the clock. They called the result the Liberty Ship, an ungainly, flat-bowed cargo vessel that could carry nearly 10,000 tons of freight. It was ugly, it was cheap, and it could be built in 42 days. Some were launched in less than a week. When the first reports of these ships reached Japanese intelligence analysts in the summer of 1942, they assumed it was propaganda designed to bolster morale. Even if the claims were true, they reasoned, the ships must be death traps poorly made, bound to shatter in storms. In a way, they were half right. Some of those welded hulls did crack in cold seas. But by the time that flaw was discovered and corrected, over 2,000 had already been built. What the Japanese admirals could not see was the philosophy behind those welds. America's wartime miracle was not in any single factory, but in its ability to absorb failure, adapt, and continue. Each ship that cracked taught engineers something. Each delay inspired an innovation. In Richmond, a female welder named Bessie Hamill noticed how welding sequence changed the stress in steel plates, a detail that would later save hundreds of ships. In Detroit, automobile engineers repurposed conveyor belts for hull assembly. In Oregon, shipyards borrowed workers from timber mills and taught them to weld steel instead of cutting logs. Every mistake became a lesson. Every lesson, a refinement. Within a year, the process that had seemed reckless became an industrial art of its own. The admirals, however, still believed in the old arithmetic of war. Quality outweighed quantity. Tradition outweighed improvisation. They took pride in the elegance of their destroyers and the precision of their torpedoes, the Type 93 Long Lance that no enemy weapon could match. They looked at the Liberty ships and saw only floating coffins, symbols of American haste. What they did not understand was that the Liberty ship was not a ship at all in the old sense. It was a logistics machine. It existed to move food, fuel, ammunition, and men faster than any blockade could starve them. Every Liberty ship that survived a voyage paid for itself a dozen times over. America was fighting an industrial war. Japan was still fighting an artisanal one. By late 1942, the first signs of imbalance were visible even to the most insulated officers. Convoys bound for Australia were arriving intact despite submarine attacks. American Marines on Guadalcanal were being resupplied faster than Japanese forces could disrupt them. Reports from frontline destroyer captains complained of running low on fuel, while the enemy seemed to have endless reserves. Still, Tokyo's planners clung to their faith in quality. They saw each American ship sunk as a small vindication. It did not occur to them that while they were counting ships in the dozens, America was counting them in the hundreds. In November of that year, Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto, serving aboard the submarine 124, recorded in his patrol log a note that would later unsettle naval headquarters. 17 merchant vessels sighted in convoy, identical type, grey hull, square bow. 2 torpedoes fired, 2 hits. Convoy continued without break. Hashimoto's crew watched through their periscope as the formation closed ranks around the burning ships and steamed onward, wave after wave of replacements filling the horizon. When the report reached Tokyo, senior officers dismissed it as exaggeration born of night fatigue. But privately, A few younger analysts began to worry. The numbers no longer made sense. The Empire was sinking ships faster than ever, yet American tonnage at sea kept increasing. Somewhere, in shipyards the Japanese could not bomb or even locate, a new kind of warfare was being forged. The next spring brought the first tangible evidence. Photographs from captured Allied magazines showed endless rows of grey hulls lined up in American harbours, cranes towering above them like forests of steel. Even through the grainy pages, the scale was unmistakable. The Americans were turning fields and mudflats into ports overnight. Entire towns had sprung up around shipyards, cafeterias, clinics, schools for welders. Over 2 million men and women were now working in American ship construction. Many were former car assemblers, plumbers, even high school students. Their training lasted weeks, not years. And yet the ships floated. They carried supplies. They kept coming. In Tokyo, disbelief began to erode into unease. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who had once studied at Harvard and understood America's industrial depth better than most of his peers, warned the cabinet that they were awakening a sleeping giant not only in arms but in production. In the first 6 months of war, he had once predicted, "I will win victory after victory, but if the war continues beyond 2 years, I have no expectation of success." Now, as 1943 approached, his prophecy was beginning to take form. Japan's merchant fleet, the vital lifeline between its islands and far-flung conquests, was shrinking under relentless submarine attack. Oil tankers burned in the South China Sea. Ori carriers from Manchuria vanished without trace. For every ton of shipping Japan lost, America launched 5 new tons. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Still, inside the Naval General Staff rooms, many officers refused to abandon the old creed. "Quantity breeds weakness," one wrote in his diary. "The enemy builds ships like toys, ours are ships for men." That sentiment, noble as it sounded, was also fatal. War had become arithmetic, and arithmetic does not respect pride. By the time the Admiralty finally ordered an expansion of merchant construction, Japan's steel mills were running dry and its shipyards bomb-scarred. They could no longer replace what they lost. The Americans, by contrast, had turned shipbuilding into a rhythm, the steady heartbeat of an industrial colossus. By the middle of 1943, Japanese naval intelligence produced a classified report titled "On the Enemy's Maritime Transport Capability." Only a few copies survived the war, but those that did reveal a quiet admission of defeat. The enemy's method of ship construction, it concluded, relies upon mass welding of prefabricated sections by unskilled labor under continuous production schedules. While quality is inferior, their speed of output far exceeds our capacity for attrition. For the first time, Japanese admirals confronted the possibility that craftsmanship itself could be a liability. The beauty of the Yamato was irrelevant if it could not be fueled, supplied, or escorted. Against an enemy that could replace entire fleets in months, perfection was a dead weight. By the winter of 1943, that realization was spreading beyond offices to the front lines. Submarine crews returning from the Central Pacific spoke of convoys so large they filled the horizon, escorted by destroyer escorts as numerous as fish. Pilots flying reconnaissance over the Solomon Islands counted harbors overflowing with new American vessels, square-bowed, ugly, and endless. In mess halls and briefing rooms, the laughter that had once greeted news of America's welded coffins faded into silence. The admirals no longer joked. They studied tonnage tables, production charts, and shipping manifests that defied all naval logic. A nation that had never built a major warship before the Great Depression was now launching more steel per month than Japan could dream of in a year. The irony was cruel and unmistakable. The same welds that Japanese officers had mocked as crude shortcuts were now binding together the very engines of their defeat. The Americans had not just turned welders into shipbuilders, they had turned industry itself into a weapon. For every Liberty ship that cracked, 10 more followed, improved, strengthened, and sailing under a new flag of efficiency. Japan's naval supremacy, forged through centuries of tradition, was being drowned not by superior gunnery or strategy, but by an ocean of welded steel. And yet, in those early months, inside that smoke-filled Tokyo chamber, the admirals could not have known how complete the transformation would be. To them, the war was still a contest of sailors and steel, spirit and discipline. They believed that the Americans' love of speed and convenience would betray them in the end. They could not imagine that convenience itself, industrial efficiency, the ability to teach ordinary people to build extraordinary machines, was becoming the new measure of strength. In that belief lay the seeds of their undoing. By the summer of 1943, the sea that had once belonged to the Empire was changing colour. It was no longer a domain of proud cruisers cutting through blue water. It was becoming an assembly line of grey hulls stretching to the horizon. Convoy after convoy steamed east and west, north and south, slow, clumsy, but relentless. Each ship was nearly identical, a flat bow, a single funnel, and the white letters U.S. stenciled on their sterns. The Japanese submariners who stalked them began to describe the same haunting pattern in their logs. Sink one, and 3 more appear. For the first time in modern history, a nation was fighting a war not with individual ships, but with production speed. In Tokyo, a confidential naval report landed on the desk of Admiral Minachi Koga, who had succeeded Yamamoto after his death. The numbers were staggering. America was now launching 50 new ships a week, freighters, tankers, destroyer escorts. Liberty ships poured from the Atlantic and Pacific coasts like water from a broken dam. By year's end, the United States would have built more than 2,700 Liberty ships, alongside a growing fleet of Victory ships, faster and stronger versions of the same design. Japan, by contrast, could produce barely a few dozen hulls per year, and only a handful of those were ocean-going transports. Steel shortages, bomb damage, and the conscription of skilled workers had crippled the once proud yards at Kure, Sasebo, and Nagasaki. Where the Americans replaced shipbuilders with untrained welders, Japan could not. Its system depended on craftsmen. Its tradition demanded perfection. But perfection could not fill fuel tanks or carry rice to garrisons starving in New Guinea. Every ship that failed to reach its destination meant another outpost doomed to isolation. Every tanker lost meant fewer aircraft in the air. And every day that passed meant America's welders, the people Japan had never feared, were forging the outcome of the war. On the battlefield, the effect was invisible at first. At Guadalcanal, Japan fought like a cornered animal, inflicting heavy casualties. But while the Empire's soldiers starved and their ships ran dry, American Marines were being fed, armed, and reinforced endlessly by convoys of Liberty ships. One Japanese officer wrote in his diary, "We destroy their troops in the jungle, yet more come every sunrise. It is as if the sea itself brings them forth." By late 1943, that illusion became reality. The U.S. Navy's new escort carriers and destroyer escorts, many constructed from the same assembly line logic as the Liberty ships, now blanketed the ocean. Japanese submarines, once the hunters, became the hunted. Convoys, guarded by sonar and radar, could now detect and destroy them long before they approached firing range. What began as a miracle of industry had become a doctrine of war. In a rare private meeting of senior officers, Admiral Koga reportedly struck the table with his fist. "We cannot win by spirit alone," he said quietly. "The giant builds while we dream." He was right. The giant, America's home front, was now an organism of production. Factories once building refrigerators or rail cars were now assembling hull sections. A welder in Richmond, California could complete an entire bulkhead faster than an entire Japanese yard could rivet one plate. Even Japanese intelligence, once skeptical, now admitted the scale was beyond imagination. They estimated that by 1944, America could replace every single ship lost since Pearl Harbor every month. For the admirals of the Imperial Navy, it was like watching a tidal wave approach from a distance, majestic, unstoppable, and certain. Nothing symbolized the contrast more painfully than the story of the battleship Yamato. She was still considered the most powerful warship afloat, her armor impenetrable, her guns the largest ever mounted on a ship. But by the time she sailed to face the American fleet at Leyte Gulf in 1944, her very existence was a relic of another age. The sea she entered was no longer ruled by duels of craftsmanship, but by logistics and numbers. Facing her were hundreds of aircraft launched from mass-produced carriers, supplied by Liberty and Victory ships that had crossed half the world without pause. The Yamato fought with all the dignity of an empire's dream, but her death was already written in steel yards thousands of miles away, built by welders who had never seen the ocean. In Washington, the philosophy that Japan had dismissed as industrial arrogance was now official doctrine. Admiral Ernest King called it the arsenal of logistics. Every major offensive from Normandy to Okinawa depended on the same quiet miracle, a sea of Liberty ships carrying everything an army could need. The ships were not beautiful, and not all survived. Some cracked in icy waters, others broke apart under strain, but for every failure, 10 new hulls replaced it, each one better than the last. It was war fought by blueprints, not bayonets, by welders, not warriors. And while Japan's admirals debated how to defend their empire with dwindling fuel and too few ships, America's welders were already building the next wave of invasion transports. By 1945, Japan's shipyards stood silent. All that remained were the ghosts of masterpieces. Hulls half-finished, rivets scattered, the forges cold. The artisans who once measured armor plates with reverence now shoveled debris after air raids. In a last desperate gesture, the Navy tried to adapt. Simplified cargo designs, unpainted hulls, even crude welding were introduced. But it was too late. There was no steel left to shape, no fuel to launch with, no time to teach new workers the skills they needed. The empire had been built on the belief that excellence could overcome size. Now, staring across the burning harbours, the surviving officers saw that efficiency had overcome everything else. When the war ended and the surviving admirals were questioned by Allied officers, many of them admitted their astonishment at what America had achieved. 1. When shown photographs of the Kaiser shipyards, simply whispered, "You built nations on our defeat." Another remarked that he had once laughed at the idea of women and students welding ships. Now he understood that those welders had defeated the Imperial Navy more surely than any fleet could. The Liberty ships were never meant to be eternal. Many were scrapped after the war, some scuttled, some rusting in forgotten harbours, but their legacy outlived steel. They proved that war in the modern world would belong not to the best craftsmen, but to those who could teach ordinary hands to do the extraordinary. A single Liberty ship still floats today, the SS Jeremiah O'Brien, preserved in San Francisco Bay. Her hull bears the marks of hurried welds and wartime urgency, yet she is proof that speed and improvisation, when guided by purpose, can change the course of history. Across the ocean, Japan rebuilt itself in peace, this time embracing the same principles it once dismissed: mass production, efficiency, adaptability. From that transformation rose a new kind of mastery, not in battleships, but in technology, industry, and innovation. History had turned full circle. The nation that once worshipped perfection learned that progress too can be an art. And the nation that once welded in desperation taught the world that even a ship born of crisis can carry the weight of victory. The war ended not with a single battle, but with a silence. The silence of shipyards that no longer roared with torches, the silence of oceans that had swallowed both pride and steel, and in that silence, the world began to take stock of what had truly changed. It was not just that Japan had lost, or that America had won. It was that the very meaning of strength had been rewritten, no longer measured by armor thickness or gun caliber, but by the speed of production, the ingenuity of workers, and the will of ordinary people to learn extraordinary skills. The Liberty ships had outlived their purpose, yet their echo would shape everything that came after. In the ruins of post-war Japan, where the ashes of Kure and Yokosuka still smouldered, American occupation officers arrived not as conquerors but as teachers, They carried with them blueprints, not for ships, but for systems. Assembly lines, mass welding, interchangeable parts. The very ideas Japan had once mocked became the seeds of its recovery. The same nation that once built one battleship in 4 years would soon learn to build thousands of cars in a week. By the 1960s, the island empire, reborn as a democracy, had become the second largest industrial power on Earth. Factories in Nagoya, Yokohama, and Osaka began humming again, this time producing machines not for war but for life: radios, motorcycles, ships, and automobiles that would soon circle the world. The irony was profound. The industrial techniques that once destroyed Japan now became the foundation of its rebirth. And the spirit that had once built the Yamato perfection through devotion found a new home in the peaceful art of precision manufacturing. Across the Pacific, America too faced a quiet reckoning. When the war ended, millions of welders, riveters, and shipfitters laid down their tools. They returned to the homes they had left behind, to farms, small towns, and cities that had learned how to work together for something greater than themselves. Most never saw themselves as heroes. They never stood on battlefields or wore medals, but their hands had built the ships that carried the war itself. In Richmond, California, an entire generation of women who had welded Liberty ships went back to civilian life. They became mothers, teachers, and engineers, and they carried with them the knowledge that they had forged the arsenal that won the war. It was a quiet legacy, but an enduring one. The realization that victory did not belong only to generals, but to the people who had turned steel and sweat into salvation. Years later, when Admiral Chester Nimitz was asked what had decided the Pacific War, he did not mention Midway or the Yamato. He simply said, "We won because we built." He meant more than ships. He meant the system, the mindset that allowed a democracy to transform overnight into an industrial giant. A system that could teach welders to build freighters, car mechanics to repair tanks, and farm girls to wire radar systems. That flexibility became America's greatest weapon, and later, the foundation of its prosperity. By the 1952, most Liberty ships were gone. Some were scrapped in foreign ports, others scuttled in artificial reefs. A few remained as freighters or training vessels, their grey hulls streaked with rust, their decks silent except for the wind. To the untrained eye, they were relics, disposable, crude, forgotten. But for those who understood what they represented, each was a monument. A monument to the ordinary people who had transformed time itself into a weapon. When one such ship, the SS John W. Brown, was towed to Baltimore for preservation, an old welder named Walter Kane watched from the dock. He had built her keel in 1942, he whispered. "I didn't know we were making history. I thought we were just making a living." The lesson spread far beyond shipyards. The same mass production philosophy that had powered Liberty ships soon became the blueprint for rebuilding Europe and Asia. In the decades that followed, it shaped the Marshall Plan, the Japanese economic miracle, and even the global trade networks that define the modern world. Where once factories built warships, they now built peace. Where once welders raced against submarines, they now competed to make the best cars, planes, and electronics. The welders who had learned their craft under floodlights in wartime now trained apprentices in peacetime. And the very act of building, of shaping steel into form, became an act of memory, a reminder of what humanity could achieve when it worked together. For Japan, the war had been a tragedy, for America, a triumph. But in their aftermath, both nations discovered the same truth. The future belongs to those who can adapt faster than they can despair. The welders who built Liberty ships proved that progress is not born from perfection but from persistence. And the Japanese engineers who rebuilt their country proved that even in defeat, reinvention is a kind of victory. The sea that once divided them became a bridge of trade, of culture, of mutual respect. Their shipyards no longer faced each other as enemies, but as partners in the same global tide of creation. If you visit the preserved Liberty ships today, the Jeremiah O'Brien in San Francisco or the John W. Brown in Baltimore, You can still hear the echo of welding torches in their steel. It is a faint hum, the heartbeat of the 20th century. Each line of weld tells a story of a nation that refused to surrender to fear, of a worker who refused to believe they couldn't make a difference. Together, those lines formed the hulls that carried not only cargo, but hope. The Japanese admirals had been right about one thing. The Liberty ships were not beautiful, but beauty had changed its meaning. Because true beauty, as history would prove, lies not in the perfection of a single masterpiece, but in the courage of a million hands that dare to build the impossible. In the summer of 1945, when the fires finally dimmed over the Pacific, the United States possessed something greater than victory understanding. The admirals in Tokyo had believed that discipline and devotion forged the strongest steel. America had shown that faith and flexibility could forge something stronger still. For every Liberty ship that crossed the ocean, a quiet message travelled with it, that greatness is not inherited from tradition, but built by those willing to learn anew. The welders who had never seen the sea became its masters, their seams, the veins through which the lifeblood of freedom flowed. Each torchlight in those shipyards had been a star over an anxious world, burning against the darkness of doubt. When Japan's surviving officers later studied America's industrial miracle, they wrote with humility, not resentment. Admiral Ugaki's diary reflected the disbelief shared by many. They built ships faster than we could count them. To him, it was not only a statement of arithmetic but of spirit, the revelation that democracy's strength lay in trust. Trust that ordinary people, given purpose and tools, could perform extraordinary acts. In that discovery lay the century's quiet revolution. Power had shifted from the sacred halls of the few to the calloused hands of the many. The welding torch had become the new symbol of sovereignty. Years later, as the Cold War dawned, both nations' former enemies looked upon their factories not as arsenals but as engines of prosperity. Japan's rebuilt yards at Kure and Nagasaki launched commercial fleets, whose hulls gleamed with peace. Across the ocean, the United States exported not weapons, but ideas, standardization, teamwork, innovation. The same assembly lines that once armed the Allies now built the ships that carried grain to Asia, automobiles to Europe, and textbooks to schools in lands that had once burned. In those convoys of commerce sailed the ghosts of Liberty ships, still serving their purpose, still crossing the sea that once divided the world. Today, the weld marks remain on preserved decks, thin silver threads tracing the hands that made them. Visitors touch those seams without realizing that each line is a sentence in the story of modern civilization. They are not perfect. Many are rough, uneven, hurried. Yet that imperfection is precisely their truth. It is the mark of humanity, unpolished but enduring. If the admirals of 1941 could stand among those ships now, they might finally understand what defeated them. Not numbers, not machines, but imagination, the audacity to attempt what tradition declared impossible. The war taught that the mightiest fleet can perish, but the idea of progress cannot. From the sparks that flew over Richmond to the rising sun over Tokyo Bay, a single truth endures. Nations are built the same way. Ships are one weld at a time, by hands that believe in tomorrow. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.